And I think we are going to end up in a place where we do less labeling of misinformation and more simply telling people what we think is right, and being willing as news organizations to hold our hands up when we think we've got it wrong. It's a really interesting question, the extent to which we really are all one and the extent to which we are absolutely not all one. And I talk a lot about the United States because I know it well and write about it, and I'm fascinated by the politics. And I don't actually think the politics is very well reported in Britain. So for instance, one of the things I tell audiences is that Donald Trump, whatever you think of him, and it's not for me to say, and I certainly don't as a BBC person, but I think you can make an argument that he's actually a moderate politically. It's a really interesting thing about him. He has this ability to capture what seems to be the kind of zeitgeist of the United States in a way that if you just disregard him as an extremist, particularly a right-wing extremist, I think you lose. So, and that is an important aspect of that is culture. So you have to see that on various issues, social issues, cultural issues, Donald Trump is actually pretty much in the mainstream in the United States. And that's borne out by all the opinion polls. And that is because culturally, the United States is very different to us. And if you expect the US to be just a much bigger, richer, version of the UK, in the old days, a version of the UK that had cars with fins, although they don't tend to have those anymore. If you expect that, and a few more guns, you're making a terrible mistake, because there is something so culturally, fundamentally culturally different about the US. And the really interesting thing, it seems to me, is the way in which that culture affects politics. Because if you think of everything, you think of technology at the moment, and I talk a bit about this sometimes to audiences. Technology is upstream of culture. In other words, there's that old phrase, the medium is the message. So the medium really matters. The technology matters. The technology is, in a sense, determinative of things that happen next, and the culture is what happens next. But what's beyond the culture? It seems to me that the politics, both in the UK but in the US as well, come downstream of the culture. So you've got the technology shaping the culture, which shapes the politics. And getting a kind of sense, or at least a discussion going with audiences, particularly audiences, I talk to people who run things sometimes, run big organizations, invest large amounts of money. It's a really interesting conversation to have about the way in which the culture has been determined, to an extent at least, by technology, but also how the culture is then itself determining politics in a way that I don't think we properly understand yet, but I also don't think we talk enough about. I tell a story to audiences sometimes about Ronald Reagan. It's apocryphal. I don't think this actually happened, but Reagan goes to a park when he's thinking of running for president, and he's actually running to be mayor of a small town in California as a kind of first step. And he goes up to someone on a park bench and says, "Name's Ronald Reagan, running for mayor of this small town. Hope I can count on your support." And the guy says, "What are you going to do about them ducks?" And there are ducks sort of wandering around the park. And Reagan says, "I'm going to pen them ducks up in the corner of the park. They won't bother you." And the guy says, "Well, you're not getting my vote because I love them ducks. I'd like them to be all over the park." There's another person on another park bench, and Reagan goes up to this person and says, "Name's Ronald Reagan, running for mayor of this small town." And the guy says, "What are you going to do about them ducks?" And Reagan says, "I'm just going to let them ducks run free because they're part of this park. They're really important." And the guy says, "Well, you're not getting my vote because I'd pen them ducks up. I hate them ducks." And at this stage, and I'm getting to the point of the story now, Reagan's people say, he's not good at politics. He'll have to go back to show business. But they turn to him to tell him this, and they see that Ronnie has gone way to the other end of the park where there's a third bench and a third person on that bench. And he steamed up to them and he said, "The name's Ronald Reagan, running for mayor of this small town." And the woman says, What are you going to do about them ducks? And Reagan, without pausing, grabs her by the shoulders and says, Madam, on the subject of the ducks, I'm with you. And it's that kind of ability of politicians to manage to persuade people that they're on their side, but also to have, as Reagan had, a real sense actually of what you want to do. And it's this sense of engagement with people that politics is really all about. It's not a new thing, but it's got to be done in different ways. The Ronald Reagan ways, through being charming on television and a film star and all the rest of it, that wouldn't work. You've got to have something else. And amazingly, Donald Trump seems to have a lot of what it takes in the modern era. Just things like vertical video, which if you're my age, you're thinking, what's going on here? Why does vertical video matter? But, as people who are younger than me know very well, and you think of the recent brilliantly successful career of the socialist guy who wants to be mayor of New York and has the Democratic nomination, Zoran Mamdani. Mamdani used vertical video. In other words, he did kind of stuff that could go quickly onto Twitter and absolutely made an immediate connection with the generation he wanted to connect to. And those sorts of things are hugely, hugely important for politicians. And the idea that attention is the new money, as I heard someone say, particularly in American politics, although it's all coming here as well. And that's something I do discuss with audiences as well, the extent of how quickly it comes here and in what form. But the idea that getting attention is the central feature of politics. And look no further than the election of 2024 and Donald Trump in the pickup truck. You remember there was a fuss about rubbish at one stage. Someone had called a group of people rubbish, and then Biden had said that it was Donald Trump's supporters who were rubbish. And the next thing, what does Trump do? He doesn't make a speech saying my supporters are not rubbish. He doesn't write an article in the New York Times. He doesn't go on one of the Sunday shows or the equivalent of the Today program, if indeed they have equivalent to the Today program. No, he gets in a rubbish cart. They hire him a rubbish cart, and he sits with his arm out, just grinning. It doesn't actually have to do an awful lot more than that. And you can say, well, that's just, it's not kind of the seriousness of politics that we once had. But actually, when it comes to political communication, like it or not, that is where we are. And the modern ways in which people communicate are hugely, hugely important. And the idea that we can just sort of take no notice of the changes that have been, it seems to me, for the birds. We've got to notice this stuff. It's a really interesting one about misinformation. I don't terribly like the term. And the reason I don't like the term is that quite often misinformation turns out, in fact, to be true. And the classic example is Hunter Biden's laptop. So I won't go into details, but people will remember that Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's very, very troubled drug addict son, put a laptop into a repair shop just before the 2020 election. And the repairman found all sorts of stuff on it that was, if not criminal, then pretty close to the mark. It had drug taking and all sorts of things. And he publicized it. He was no fan of the Bidens. And immediately, I can't remember the exact number, but a large number of security professionals wrote a letter to the New York Times saying, this is classic Russian misinformation. That's what's going on here. And Twitter, which in those days was not owned by Elon Musk, suppressed the New York Post's story about the Hunter Biden laptop. They did not allow people to pass it from one person to the other because they said it was misinformation. It turns out to be essentially true. And I think one of the really difficult things when you go into misinformation is identifying some things as misinformation and some things as truth, and trying to batter people over the head with your notion of those two concepts. And I don't think it works. And I also don't think it works because when something genuinely is misinformation or disinformation, deliberately there to obfuscate, The idea that people are only believing it because they're not in full receipt of the facts, and as soon as you tell them the facts, they'll change their minds. I'm terribly sorry. That nice man from the BBC's told me I'm completely wrong. That's silly of me. I'll just carry on and completely change my worldview. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that in the modern world. And it's another really interesting aspect of the world we now live in. People want to be part of communities, particularly people who feel at the bottom rung of every ladder. They want to be able to have a sense of themselves. They want to be able to stick two fingers up to the people endlessly telling them what's right and what's wrong, what's misinformation, what's not misinformation. And I think it's so the honest answer is I don't really use the term misinformation. It makes me uncomfortable. And I think we are going to end up in a place where we do less labeling of misinformation and more simply telling people what we think is right, and being willing as news organizations to hold our hands up when we think we've got it wrong, and allowing people to decide, yeah, I trust them because on balance, I think they are trying properly to do things well. And maybe I don't trust someone else because on balance, a lot of the things they say turn out to be complete baloney. But that is as far as it goes for me. I don't think there's anything more you could do. I think you just got to try your best. The thing I want people to take away from all the engagements they have with me, whether it's a speech or a kind of smaller discussion, is that it was fun, actually, above all else, that you learned things that were amusing. Because I've never been on the kind of sanctimonious end of journalism. I went into journalism, actually, to have fun. And I don't think that's a bad thing to admit. I didn't go into journalism to change the world. I'm fascinated by people and what makes them tick. And people who listen to me are generally also fascinated by people, what makes them tick, and by the future of society and all those things. So all the highfalutin stuff I'm interested in and we can talk about, but actually more than anything, I think mostly, particularly in the modern world and face to face, where you've got someone there, a real person in front of you, you want to be amused and you want to have fun. And that's unquestionably what I'm aiming for.